Welcome back to the Tank Me Later podcast, which is part of Fantasy Basketball International. This is episode 26. Bdub is joining me once again as we finish talking about the Pacific Division. Let's go ahead and get into it. All right, before we get started, just a quick reminder that sports betting has rapidly risen in popularity, and I want to connect you all with an opportunity to get started or get ahead. Having multiple sportsbook accounts is the most simple way to maximize your profits, and there has never been a better time to sign up. When you visit my page, signupexpert.com/TML, you'll be connected to all the sportsbooks in your region, along with a review of each platform and its unique benefits. All of these sportsbooks have valuable sign-up offers for new users, and when you register through my link, you will automatically receive the top offer at each one. When you use multiple sportsbooks, you ensure that you can always access the best available odds, which is key to successful sports betting. If you want to take advantage of these benefits and support our brand, please consider signing up for your next sportsbook at signupexpert.com/TML. Like I said, this is episode 26, and I'm going to go ahead and bring Bdub in so that we can talk about FBI, what's going on. I know I was trying to bring him in as he was bringing himself in, so he kind of, gives a couple pump fakes before, but now he's here. Bdub, how are you doing?
Hi, mate. How you doing?
All right, I'm doing well. It's early in the week, not much time for anything to have gone wrong, but everything's going great so far. Can't complain at all. How are things with FBI and the World Cup or anything else that's going on?
Yeah, that's a good question, because when you ask me how is my week has been I've been doing two things, maybe three if you count sleep, but looking after children, and I've got three of them, and they're all very young. And when I've managed to get a spare minute or a spare couple of hours, it's straight to the computer, much to my wife's chagrin. And configuring leagues and Discord and the like. So I guess the key updates for this week are, one, the World Cup. So I think most people would have, registered their interest by now. I believe that most of the people that have reached out through FBI channels have either received an invite or are just about to receive an invite. But if you haven't received an invite yet, I've put a form in our Discord. It's in the World Cup info channel. It's just like basically a Google form. The best way to secure a spot would be to complete that form. So I've got about 50 spots left in the Northern Division, which is the Northern Conference, which is the last conference to fill. But then, believe it or not, in all the other three divisions, not every single person has joined and registered yet. So I've sent a few reminder emails out, and basically we're approaching the point where if they don't join and register, they're just going to get cut, which is going to free up some more spots. So they'll go to the people that have filled in that form. Get into that form, fill that in. Bit more info on the World Cup. The draft will start on the 2nd of October. So we're tracking to good time. Now the next thing to update is redraft leagues, just the standard leagues. They have the first drop has gone live. So there's, I believe, 8 head-to-head leagues there. Some $20 leagues, $50, one $100 league, and one that's about $500. That's the first of probably 4 or 5 drops, just depending on how demand is this year. We've left things a little bit later than we normally would, so I'm hoping we sort of replicate what we had last year. People have been hanging out for them. But the next drop, hopefully today, will be Roto Leagues, doing 8-cat and 9-cat this year because there's demand for both. And then the drop after that will be back to head-to-head, probably some more of the same that I already mentioned. Plus, there'll be a few sort of head-to-head leagues that are like different to normal in some way, shape, or form. So that could be, we're going to have a 16-team head-to-head league. We're going to have maybe 1 or 2 with an auction draft rather than a slow draft. And then after that, we might do some points, but we'll probably just continue to top up the roto leagues and the head-to-head leagues until they're completely exhausted. So that's what's happening at FBI at the moment, mate. You can find all those redraft leagues in the redraft info, redraft access, redraft chat channels. You should be able to figure out how to get into them from there. So I'll go through after this pod and update the counts, and we might drop a few more in straight after this.
Yeah, that's, I mean, obviously incredibly exciting as that's getting very close now to draft starting. I think, I don't know, maybe this is subject to change, but I was just looking at mine in the West, and it said the draft was starting October 1st, which is just a few days away. So,
yeah, October 1st for you, October 2nd for me, and you know, if the conference isn't completely full, that draft day might get pushed back a little bit. We do have a bit of buffer room in there, but hoping obviously that over this weekend it's done and dusted.
Yeah, still less than a week away, potentially maybe about a week away, depending on if everybody's able to get signed in, get into the league. But it's coming up quick. It's going to be a lot of fun. But we're going to go ahead and wrap up talking about the Pacific Division instead of aiming to talk about all 5 teams and ending up going really long and having to cut off 2 of them. We have all the time in the world now to discuss these 2. So still shouldn't take as long as last time, but should still get plenty of detail. And we'll go ahead and start with the Suns, which means we'll wrap up with the Clippers. But Suns, you know what? I should have pulled this up. Actually, I have it right here already. Suns finished 45-37 last year. Lost in the second round to the Nuggets. Dealt with an injury to Chris Paul, an injury to DeAndre Ayton. But before that, it was a pretty competitive series. Like, it was a 2-2 split, and then they were without Ayton. So it's you're always in the series when you have guys like KD and Devin Booker. They obviously made the trade to add Bradley Beal this summer. So that's going to be 3 guys who have been elite scorers at different points of their career. They're not all going to average 28 points per game, but Beal has shown he can average 30. KD's shown he can average 30. And I don't think anybody would doubt that Devin Booker could average 30 per game if he wasn't having to share the ball with other stars to try and win a championship. Still have Ayton, though those rumors I don't think will slow down before the season starts or even at the trade deadline. I think there's definitely a chance that he gets moved as they try and figure out what they need to add. But I think the most interesting thing is who's going to play point guard. Because, there's reports that it's going to be Bradley Beal. But we've seen, over the last 2 seasons, Beal averaged 5.4 assists per game last year, 6.6 the year before. 2 seasons before that, he averaged 30.6 points and 6.1 assists. So we've seen him obviously with a really high usage rate, probably higher than what he's going to have this year. Be a good playmaker. We've also seen that from Devin Booker before Chris Paul got there. What do we make of what this dynamic could look like with Bradley Beal reportedly running point guard, but also, Devin Booker's going to have the ball in his hands. Kevin Durant's going to have the ball in his hands. So what do we kind of make of what this looks like from a fantasy perspective? Because we know they're all going to score points, but is one of them going to get a bunch of assists? Are none of them going to get a bunch of assists? Is a couple of them going to be okay with it? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, that's it's an interesting question. Well, first of all, I'd say that just listening to various pods, both fantasy related and NBA related, it seems to me that I guess both industries seem to be a little bit down on Beal. You do get a few people sort of commenting really positively about him, but I think overall, people seem to think that I think they're underrating him versus what he could potentially be on this team. Obviously, that's fueled by sort of a poorer performance than usual the last season or 2, some injuries on a bad Washington team. Somewhat overshadowed by Kristaps last season. But he's still a really good player. And I don't think playing with, a couple of other stars is necessarily going to impact him as much as, it seems to be the case. believe he's going sort of mid 50s, sometimes in the 60s in redraft leagues. So I am pretty keen to snap him up at that point, because he's obviously returned, late first, but more often than that, second or third round value. When I say late first, I don't mean he finished the season as a first round player, but he definitely had some stretches there. And on a team where the focus isn't completely on him, where he's not the sort of the be all and end all, to throw in a little pun there, I think perhaps he's going to have a little bit more breathing room to do his thing. And I can foresee him being quite a good pickup in fantasy drafts this year, but sort of skirted around the point. What about Point Bill? I think you're pretty much right that, those guys are going to share the ball handling responsibility. You might see, who's going to organize the offense? I guess that's the point. Bill's pretty good off the ball. So I don't think he'll be exclusively bringing the ball down, having the ball in his hands. He'll want to be running around and picking it up. I think, Booker can do a bit of that. Even KD can bring the ball down the floor. We've seen him do it often enough. And, there's other guys on this team like Eric Gordon and so on, who can also manage some of those ball handling responsibilities. So it is going to be interesting to see a team with basically 3 shooting guards, starting. But yeah, I think it's sort of overrated. If you're not going to be playing a lot of pick and roll with DeAndre Ayton, do you really need to have like a traditional point guard on the floor? So point Beal, point Booker. I do think Beal will have most of the responsibility there when he's on the floor, but I don't think it really matters too much for fantasy purposes.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's going to truly benefit, but I don't think it's also going to be a train wreck. Like I think some people may have thought when it first happened, like, oh, who's going to play point guard? There's only one basketball. I don't think any of those guys are players where, oh, all they can do is to have the ball in their hand and need to dribble the air out of the ball to get a shot off. Like we've seen Beal and Devin, all 3 of them be very good off the ball, especially like when KD was with Golden State, really good at moving off the ball. Booker and Beal are both good at, coming off screens, getting to their spots and attacking off of that. So I think it could end up being a case of who has the hot hand. Even throughout games, 1 or 2 of them could be sitting on the bench, which still gives the third star the opportunity to be the focal point of the offense. So I think all of them will be fine statistically. I'm not buying, even if Bradley Beal is the quote unquote point guard, like you said, the guy who organizes the offense or the lead ball handler, sometimes I don't think they're going to fully commit to that and take away his off-ball game. I don't think it's necessarily going to result in, we've seen him and Booker both average 6 assists per game in a season. I don't see it getting higher than that, but also, it's probably going to be, maybe it won't be. Maybe 6 assists is kind of reasonable at a max of 6 assists for potentially both Booker and Beal, while KD averages 5. I could see it. But yeah, I don't think it's going to end up being, oh, Bradley Beal's point guard, DeAndre Ayton sets him a million screens and he attacks off of it and finds Booker and KD. I think it's going to be a pretty balanced offense that results in all the stars getting to their spots to get good shots. And it's going to be at times very hard to guard, and maybe at other times with a lot of potentially ISO ball at times frustrating, because with 3 guys that good, it's probably in your mind, it should be impossible to guard. But if things aren't clicking, especially early on, I wouldn't be necessarily shocked by that.
Yeah, as you're talking, I completely agree with that analysis. And as you're talking, I'm sort of recalling my thought process from earlier this year when we saw the Suns in the finals and Devin Booker was doing a bit of those point guard responsibilities. So my recollection of that, now that I think about it, is that he actually did that quite well. And I think Booker with the ball in his hands could actually be the permutation of that works out on the Suns more often than not. So point Beal, I'd say definitely he will have that. He will be bringing the ball down quite a bit and orchestrating the offense. But yeah, sort of come to think of it, I think actually it'll be Booker that gets the not the lion's share, but gets more of that responsibility than either Beal or Durant, even if they do sort of get the season kicking with Beal in that role.
Yeah, and I imagine there will be, I mean, they'll spend the whole season trying to figure it out so that they're ready for the playoffs. I don't think that they're a team that's going to, like, their priority is trying to win a championship. When you have a team like this with Kevin Durant's an aging star, Bradley Beal's missed a ton of games, but he also hasn't really been part of a true competitive team that's made, I don't think he's made the conference finals. I think the furthest that he's made it is the second round with the Wizards. And then Booker obviously has made the finals, still hasn't won a ring. That's kind of what they're going for. So their priority is going to be on that. So they'll experiment with a lot, I imagine. I mean, I think Booker and Beal will have success in that role, but yeah, I don't think it's anything that over the course of the season, like point guard Bradley Beal isn't going to be a huge spike for him.
Probably the only other thing to mention is if it's not working out for any of them, I think the only other guys on their roster that you could sort of put into that point guard category is Jordan Goodwin, which I have seen him go off the board in the last round of a draft only a couple of times. I think that's a little bit ambitious. He was certainly going higher than you would expect in some of the dynasty stuff we were doing over the offseason. I think that's not really warranted. And then I believe they've got Saban Lee on the team as well, who has sort of handled the ball, I believe, in Detroit and perhaps a couple of other teams that I can't recall right now in the past. So, you know, if worst comes to worst, maybe one of those guys is getting a bit more run than we would expect.
Yeah, definitely could happen. Or maybe even if we're looking ahead, a move at the trade deadline. Oh, this whole point Beal or point Booker, point whoever wants to be point guard experiment isn't really working. We need to trade DeAndre Ayton. We need to get a real point guard and like a stretch four that can start alongside these guys and then roll with Drew Eubanks at center or something like that. It's not an ideal option, but when you have three either stars or superstars like that, that's kind of what you have to roll with.
Yeah, exactly. And that's an interesting point you raise about Ayton. Maybe we can leave it for the third topic of this discussion, but you know, does he even start the season on the Suns?
Yeah, we'll get to that, I guess. But I guess we'll briefly talk about, or maybe not so briefly, just to stick with the order, where to draft Kevin Durant. I'm not, if you have the FBI ADP, the Yahoo ADP is 11.3. I don't know what the FBI one is looking like. If you have it.
I don't have it up on the screen right now, but I can have it up soon. But I basically know that it's in that sort of around that 9 to 11 range. Maybe around 9, 10, 11, depending on which league. I put it to you this way. He was definitely going rather late when we first started doing draft onlys in July. And I mean like as late as 13th or 14th. That's definitely come in. And you're now seeing him in that sort of weird sort of 8 to 10, 11 zone. Next to names like, Dame, sort of maybe just a little bit behind Steph Curry, but right around there with LaMelo Ball and those guys.
Yeah. If you look at 9cat Z-Scores, 9cat rankings, since his rookie season, he's finished at least 8th every single season on a per game basis. But I think the question that I have, the reason that he's a late first round guy probably is the games played. And I know we briefly talked about this last time when we were talking about, I don't remember if we were talking about the Lakers, the Warriors, or who, but the games played and the fact that he played 47 games last year, 55 the year before that, 35 the year before that, and then obviously missed that whole previous season after the injury in the finals for the Warriors. When he's on the court, he's great, but the games played, injury risk kind of thing, you can't game plan. I mean, you can kind of game plan for injuries. You can't predict when injuries will happen. There's guys that are quote unquote injury prone. If Kevin Durant went and played 70 games this year, it would be like a pleasant surprise, but I don't think it's not out of the question because, injuries aren't necessarily predictable. But with knowing that he's played in, if I'm doing math really quick, 137 games over the last 4 years, like, how do you feel about taking him kind of in that late first round range?
Well, so just to clarify, I was correct in my recollection. So his ADP is 10. He's now latest data, but the actual average draft slot for him is 10.93. So he's going around, 10, 11. Obviously, sometimes earlier, sometimes later. But that is also a function of him being drafted a bit later and then possibly now being drafted earlier. So his ADP is coming in. How do I feel about it? I feel pretty good about it, honestly. I feel pretty good about taking KD anywhere after the top 6. So the others in that zone, as I said before, Steph Curry, LaMelo Ball, but also Giannis and AD. They're the sort of guys that are also in and around that zone. And I feel pretty good taking KD anywhere in that area, even as early as 7. And the reason being, to your point, when he plays, he performs really well, and he's going to be, a top player, a first round player, perhaps even the top of the first round, the top 6. And then as far as the injury risk is concerned, I mean, personally with KD, I think that's somewhat overblown, even though that there has been a track record over the previous, several seasons where he hasn't played all the games. The thing that I look at with KD is just sort of his attitude. So even when he was on the Nets and he was sort of, making grumbling noises the offseason before last, and sort of, I think he requested a trade at one point, which they didn't end up trading him. At that point, they did end up trading him later. He had all the, maybe not the reason, but he had all the table was set for him to come into the season, maybe not 100%, maybe missing more games than he might do, sort of dragging his feet a little bit. But he didn't. He sort of came in and he played. He's a competitor. I think he's got a reputation for being a fierce competitor. So if he's healthy, he's going to play. And if he's playing, he's going to try and win. So I sort of feel like, he is going to be putting his best foot forward in terms of looking to play as much as possible, give the Suns the best record they can have, so they can finish close to the top of the West. They can set themselves up for a playoff run. I think at this point in his career, he's all about, winning that championship. So if that means, he might miss some games toward the end of the season, particularly in those last couple of weeks while he's preparing for their playoff run, I mean, who cares? All the FBI leagues are finishing sort of, mid to late March. So that's not going to affect you. I believe that it's only really going to be if there's something outside of his control where he's getting an injury, that's going to be the case. And you really just can't predict that. Like, when you went to the Suns last year, he slipped on the court during warm-ups. It's just a freak accident, right? So if you're building that type of thing into your assessment, into your predictions, I think that's erroneous, and you're going to make bad decisions if that's what you're doing. If he had like a dodgy knee and it was a reoccurring injury and he was injuring the same thing every season, I think, okay, yeah, you can factor that in. All right, the knee's wobbly, it can't hold up, a full season. He's going to go down a few times. He's going to miss games. I just don't think that's the case in KD's. I don't think that's what it is in KD's case. I think he's going to be trying to be playing. They're going to be motivated. I think as well that we've got that new rule where you're not qualifying for awards and so on unless you hit that, I believe it's 65 games. So, I mean, I'm sort of expecting him to play at least that. And if he does, clearly a first-round guy for me.
I agree. If he plays 65 games, first-round guy easy. I just look at because there's the Achilles tear in the finals. Obviously wasn't able to play that next season, then played 35, 55, and 47 games. And I know it's not injuring the same thing over and over again like a Kawhi, where it's just like consistently knee issues. I think it's just looking at the track record of, okay, since he suffered this major injury, his body just hasn't been able to hold up. He's 35 now. His, slender frame, long legs. So it's like, injuries that have kept on happening. Not saying it's like re-injuring and like those, okay, like it's like the knee, like you said, but I think it's looking at the numbers, it makes me be a little reserved. I don't think he's not a first round player. I'm like kind of happy taking him at 11, but I think you said this last time, that like 7 to 9 range is probably the worst place to draft, because you said you feel confident taking him at 7. I don't think I would, just looking at, okay, Steph is there. Steph is probably in that same boat of aging star that has missed games the last few years that he wasn't necessarily doing previously. Same thing with Damian Lillard. I don't know if a trade revitalizes him and all of a sudden he's playing more games. I don't know. AD is kind of in that range. And then it really feels like Giannis is the only one in that range, except maybe like a LaMelo, who actually is coming off playing like 33 games last year. That's, at their peak, but also I feel like confident that Giannis is going to play 60 something games at the minimum. Whereas the rest of the guys, based on what's happened the last few years, I'm not as confident. So I think my conclusion is that if he's there at 11 or 10, happy to take him. It's 7 to 9 range. It's just tough for me right now. I'm just really hoping that I'm not there with any drafts, which now I know I'm probably going to pick from there in all my drafts just because I'm saying that out loud. But maybe I'll reach for LaMelo in one or take KD or Steph in another. But we'll kind of see what happens. Hopefully, I'm not wishing. Let me just clarify. I'm not hoping that Kevin Durant only plays in 50 games so that I'm right. Like I hope I'm wrong. I hope he plays in 70 games. That'd be great. But I think looking at the last few seasons, I'm just not as confident. And I think guys like, I think we mentioned this last time, guys like Kawhi and Paul George, like their ADP has kind of slipped a little bit because of that. KD and Steph haven't really been impacted as much. I'm just a little bit, I have more reservations drafting him than say a guy like Giannis in that range.
It's funny you say that, because actually I would lump Giannis in with like a KD and a Steph. And out of those guys, I would be more confident from an injury perspective, even though I just talked for a couple of minutes before about how I'm not drafting based on injuries. I'd be more comfortable with Dame. To be honest, I think he's been the most durable out of those guys throughout his career. He's had some sort of abdominal issues and what have you, and he's missed some time toward the end of seasons. I know that part of that has been to do with the Blazers trying to get a good draft pick. And it's funny with Dame that he was sort of missing time the last few years around Christmas. No conspiracy theory there, but sort of tend to have that abdominal issue going into December, and then missing some time around Christmas, and then being fine for the rest of the season. So I'm actually reasonably confident in Dame. I also think he's probably going to come into this season with a chip on his shoulder, no matter which team he's at, and be looking to really, I guess, pour cold water over all the scuttlebutt that's been floating around about him. But back to Giannis really quickly, because I didn't want this to be an extensive point. Giannis does have what seems to be a chronic issue with his knee, because he's injuring that same knee again and again. And I was listening to some podcast talking about it, and the character of that injury seems to be one where it's sort of like, it's the joint degrading. And there's not really that much you can do to sort of reverse that process. So where KD's injuries have, not been mild by any stretch of the imagination, but they're sort of cropping up on different parts of his body that don't seem to be reoccurring. Someone like Giannis seems to be getting an issue sort of in the same area, which to me is slightly more concerning. Despite the obvious age difference and, between the two of them.
And that's fair. I was just looking at Dame because in my mind, he has barely played the last 2 seasons, but you're right. It's because of Portland tanking, and he just happened to have that random abdominal injury. So you're right. I wouldn't necessarily lump Dame in with injury prone. That's a good point. I guess in my mind, he's 33 now, had missed games, but there's a reason for it. I think that if he's in Portland, I'm less confident that that's going to continue, because I still don't think that, I don't think 29 games like he did 2 years ago is what I'm saying. But he played 58 last year. I could definitely see Portland pulling the plug early again. But I also don't think he's there. Like, I mean, there's reports that a lot of people think he's going to be gone before media day on Monday. So we could be days away from a trade.
Well, that's funny. That's an interesting topic too, actually. I think I just can't see Dame being on Portland.
I agree.
Next season, I just don't think that's happening. And then even if they didn't figure out a trade for him, why would you play him? Why would you risk him suffering some kind of season-ending injury and then evaporating any any sort of equitable trade deal into nothing? Totally cannot see him staying on Portland. And if he does, I don't even think he would play, to be honest, until he's traded. And then just finally on Dame, I think this media day deadline's a bit of a false deadline. Like, it's just sort of made up. I was listening to Hollinger and Duncan last night, and this is effectively what they were saying, that it's the media likes to talk about how media day is a deadline, but actually there's no significance to it from a contractual perspective. So whether it does happen, hopefully it does, because we'd all like to get a bit of closure on this.
Right.
Whether it does happen before media day or not, I don't think there's any real reason to think that it would. I think maybe training camp might be a more applicable deadline. But it's probably a good segue into talking about DeAndre Ayton, because just still on this Dame thread, the latest sort of rumors seem to be that the Suns might be the third team involved in a trade where basically, Dame, let's say he's going to, he's going off to Miami, for instance, or Toronto, wherever you think he might end up. And that the Suns get involved and effectively are sending DeAndre Ayton to the Blazers and then receiving Nurkic back. I mean, would be, I think, perhaps a silly move for the Suns, because they'd be picking up someone with much more injury risk, you would imagine, who's might be fractionally better than DeAndre Ayton in some ways, but not significantly so. The only real benefit to that I could see for the Suns would be, like a saving in tax. Obviously they're paying about $6 for every dollar in salary. So if they downgrade DeAndre Ayton's $30 million contract, roughly in that zone, to Nurk's $15 million contract, again, roughly in that zone, don't quote me, but it's roughly there. That's a $15 million saving up front, but then sitting behind that, there's another 15 times 5, $75 million in taxes. So, it's a $75 million saving right there by sort of subbing out DeAndre Ayton for Nurkic. And then that could create some more flexibility for the Suns, maybe to bring in a point guard or, a traditional point guard or something along those lines down the road. So, interesting if that was to transpire. If I was the Blazers, I'd be all about that. I think DeAndre on the rebuilding Blazers would be pretty freaking good, to be honest with you. I'd switch Nurk out for him any day of the week, and it's not like they have much in the way of salary concerns over there. They're sitting pretty. They're sitting pretty in that regard. What do you reckon about that?
So I saw that trade rumor. I think it was from a Portland beat reporter that kind of said that the Suns, or maybe it was a Suns one, I don't remember. It was for one of the teams that said that the Suns might be interested in trading Ayton for Nurkic to get a better defensive center, and immediately got like everyone either quoting it or commenting and say, what do you mean defensive minded center and Jusuf Nurkic? Like, is this the same Nurk that we're talking about? Because, like, first of all, he hasn't played a ton in the last few seasons. He's missed a lot of games, but also I don't think he's necessarily a really, really good defender. So to me, that's not necessarily, it didn't make a lot of sense to me to say, okay, we're going to trade DeAndre Ayton, who we just drafted #1 overall 5 years ago, gave an extension to, has been good to get Nurkic, who I just don't think is as good as Ayton straight up, but also adding in as a third team into that deal. I thought the idea of Portland and Miami in this case, I guess, adding in a third team would be somewhere to reroute Tyler Hero. So I guess that could even involve a fourth team to where Hero goes, because Hero wouldn't be going to Phoenix, because as much fun as it would be, you're not going to have Tyler Hero, Bradley Beal, Devin Booker, Kevin Durant in a lineup. I mean, that's when you kind of say, okay, there's one basketball, guys. We can't do that.
If Phoenix and Miami are involved with this trade, that there has to be a team to pick up Hero.
Has to be.
Yeah. And to make all of that work. Absolutely, for sure.
Yeah. So Ayton's a guy that I kind of shied away from last year, and it was mostly because of what happened during their Game 7 blowout loss to Dallas, when things kind of boiled over on the sideline with him and Monty Williams. I was like, I don't know how that's going to look. I'm probably going to just avoid drafting him, because I don't know what his relationship looks like with Monty Williams. It just kind of scared me. I'm less concerned about that this year. I think if he's still in Phoenix, he probably sees less shots, but also they don't have another great center option. So he's still going to play a ton of minutes. I imagine they're going to have him play more down low where possible, because somebody's going to have to rebound. I could see a situation where DeAndre Ayton also gets better looks. He can still shoot the mid-range, but when you have 3 elite scorers on the perimeter, you can probably get some good looks inside. I see a scenario where DeAndre Ayton actually has one of the better seasons of his career while still in Phoenix, even if it's more of one of the better seasons from an efficiency standpoint and impact standpoint than necessarily just box score stats such as scoring. I see the path on paper. Whether or not they keep him around is another question.
Yeah, well, Frank Vogel's got a decent track record getting the best out of centers like DeAndre Ayton. So we'll see what he can do with him. But in a team where his offense isn't really required, you're asking him to effectively be a role player, focus on protecting the rim, pulling down boards, and that kind of thing. Is the difference of Ayton at 30 million versus, say, Bismack Biyombo, who they could bring back on a minimum at under 3 million? Is that so? That's 27 million up front, but it's actually, when you include the tax bill, you're sort of talking, 160 minus 27. So, like 120, $130 million difference in what the owners have to pay. It's a bit of a luxury having Ayton on the roster at that price tag on this particular team. Whilst I think that he could be more impactful, it's going to sort of be predicated on him accepting the role, which I think is what has caused the tension with Monty Williams and the franchise in the past. So, if he's been pissing and moaning about it, since he was drafted, right? Soon after he was drafted, since they got good. Why would it be any different this year? I mean, sometimes with a personality player like that, I mean, obviously don't know the guy at all, but sometimes it's like he's going to have to be traded to another team and either get that role or not get that role again for him to sort of look at where he sits within the broader NBA landscape more realistically. And I don't know if he ever does that on Phoenix. And just the cost of his contract and the position of this team, I don't think he makes it through the whole season on the Suns personally.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you think? Well, I mean, you just kind of said it. You don't think he makes it through the season. Do you think this is a trade? If you were to guess, do you think it happens before the season? Do you think it happens at the deadline, somewhere in between? What do you kind of think?
I actually think maybe before, but I'm quite conscious that we're running out of time. I think the logic behind that sort of thought is that Matt Ishbia has been pretty aggressive since coming in as the owner. Trades for Beal, trades for Kevin Durant, not in that order, in the opposite order. Has sort of pretty aggressive, like cutting campaign and, making those moves around the edges. Did a pretty good job bringing in, vets on minimum salaries, like Yuta Watanabe. Who else did they bring in? Drew Eubanks, Eric Gordon, all pretty solid basketball moves and, pretty quick, like right off the bat. So he hasn't really shown me that he's been patient with his new toy, the Phoenix Suns. So when it comes to DeAndre Ayton, potentially sort of the biggest chip that he has yet to play, I don't see why he would hold off, or his front office would hold off sort of making that move if something palatable came available. The Pacers have shown interest in the past, but I believe because the Suns matched their offer to bring him back, that he's ineligible to be traded to the Pacers this year. So it wouldn't be them. But I think there's a reasonable chance that he ends up on the Blazers as part of this Dame trade. And if not, I mean, he could be dumped for pennies on the dollar sort of towards the trade deadline, because it would, as I said, represent a big saving. And if things aren't going, if the Suns aren't top 1 or 2 in the West, they're going to want to do something to give themselves a quote unquote better chance in the playoffs. And I think DeAndre will be sort of the first log on the chopping block.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know if you agree with this, but anywhere he ends up is probably going to be a better situation for him to have a really good fantasy season. I think, like you said, it would take accepting his role. There's a path. Like I was saying, there's a path for him to have success in Phoenix. I think if he goes somewhere else, like a Portland, on a tanking team that actually probably has a pretty solid lineup, he could have some success there in a larger role.
He would kill on Blazers. Like he could be, third round guy, dare I say it, even a second round guy over there. Like no center depth whatsoever. They just brought in, I forget his name, but the starting center from the Australian team, Rape, something like that. Reap, something along those lines. They just brought him in. They've got, I think it's Jarris Walker there as a big, and then Nurk. So really nobody in Ayton's league. He'd get all the minutes he could handle, and he'd be included in the offense much more so on Blazers, I reckon.
Yeah, definitely. And last note on the Suns, is there a player other than the core four, which would be obviously KD, Devin Booker, Bradley Beal, DeAndre Ayton, that's worth, I don't even know if you could say roster consideration in a 12-team league, but maybe in like a slightly deeper format, somebody that could provide some fantasy value this season?
Yeah, I was going to say, can I say nobody? But
you can, but
since you put the caveat that maybe this is like a sort of a deeper league question, I think there's probably two guys that stand out. It's definitely not Eric Gordon. I'm just not a fan of his game at this point in his career, in terms of fantasy, that is. But I think Keita Bates-Diop is one and Drew Eubanks is the other. Drew would need the chips to fall the right way for him to get a more expansive role. I think he was a rosterable player on the Blazers down the stretch last season when he had that opportunity. So if Ayton is dealt, I think unless a center's coming back, Drew Eubanks is going to be getting most of those center minutes for the Suns. I would imagine that they would bring in another center, probably like a Bismack Biyombo or something along those lines. So he wouldn't be getting like 35 a night or anything like that. But he'd be interesting, predicated on a trade of DeAndre Ayton. But sort of silly to base your drafting strategy on things that might happen. Hence why we don't take Ayton in that, that third or fourth round, because, while he might be traded, it's no given. The only guy that could be sort of interesting, could give you something. He's not going to get a lot of usage, you wouldn't think, but Keita Bates-Diop showed a bit on the Spurs last year. He's a bit of an all-rounder. sort of low volume points, rebounds, some defensive stats. His percentages aren't too bad. So given that he's probably the fifth Beatle on the Suns team, he'll probably get the most minutes out of all of those remaining players. And if that's the case, he's probably going to have the better fantasy output. So maybe more for a points league consideration than anything else. But I don't know if if he sort of steps it up a little bit, or he fits like a glove with those starters, maybe he does give you late round value. But I wouldn't draft him.
Yeah, I don't think there's anybody else worth drafting. The other guy's name that I would throw out there, maybe you disagree entirely, but Josh Okogie, who was really good down the stretch. Well, he had a good stretch of games for a couple minutes there where he actually showed an ability to hit threes, and we know he can get steals. He really can't do much else, but I think having someone like him to play a good bit of the perimeter defense is going to help them out, so he could start or just play a pretty decent role. But like I said, his shooting percentage wasn't great either. He's just going to give you – he showed the ability to hit a three or a little bit more per game and get over a steal per game, but not much else. But that's kind of what it's going to be in Phoenix outside of those four guys.
Yeah.
All right. Well, unless you got – cool. So we will move on to our second and, I guess, last team, which is the Clippers, who, while I'm pulling this up, they finished fifth in the West, 44-38. We're doing, I think, didn't they win game one against the Suns? Or maybe it was game two. No, it was game one because Russell Westbrook had like a horrible shooting night, but he made a really big play at the end, had a good statistical game. Won game one against the Suns, and I'm pretty sure the Suns won the next four because Kawhi wasn't able to play after that, and Paul George was already out. Russell Westbrook looked like prime Russ statistically in that series. But it's kind of been the same story for the Clippers the last, I guess, since they brought in Kawhi and Paul George, where it's what if the only time that they were actually healthy for full playoffs was when they blew a 3-1 lead to the Nuggets in the bubble. But every other time it's been either Kawhi or Paul George or both hurt. So we haven't really gotten, I think if you could say like if they had a full healthy postseason, they should be considered a contender every season. And they have been preseason, but then, between injuries and other things happening, it hasn't worked out well at all. But the main question is the first one: can we trust Kawhi or Paul George? And I'll just go ahead and ask that. What do you think about drafting Kawhi or Paul George? I'd assume early third round this year. I know it's been kind of going down. I'm pretty sure last year was still second round, but now it's like early third round value to try and get these guys who, when they're on the floor, are top 10 at least fantasy options, I'd say. Maybe not top 10 anymore. Maybe like top 15, top 20 when they're on the court. But obviously, they just tend to miss a ton of games.
Well, I would say, first of all, they are actually going early fourth round.
Okay.
Compared to my ADP data, or the FBI ADP data. So Paul George going, 36 overall. So the last pick in the 12th round. And then Kawhi going 38th. So the second pick of the fourth round. And the guys around them are Miles Turner, Pascal Siakam, Desmond Bane, Nikola Vucevic, and Chet Holmgren. And I haven't run this ADP data for about 2 weeks, but I can tell you for sure that Desmond Bane has been shooting up.
I was going to say that sounds pretty low.
Yeah, he has been going up. There's, I guess, what I noticed doing the draft onlys was there were some people really high on Desmond Bane, just as an aside here, taking him, in that early third round sort of territory. And then others are just letting him slide. So I think with other analysts sort of coming out and, projecting him late second round sort of territory, his stock's been rising. But Pascal is sort of still in that same range. You've got Nikola Vucevic in that same range. The other two interesting names there are sort of Chet Holmgren and Evan Mobley. So that's the type of talent that is surrounding them in ADPs. So would you take those guys in that range? And can we trust them? So I think trust, it's a bit of a loaded word when it comes to these two guys. You know, I trust Paul George's attitude and his that he wants to play. Kawhi, I still trust that he wants to play, but just not as much as Paul George. I think with Kawhi, you know, his insistence on surrounding himself with his own medical staff and not having open lines of communication with whichever organization, whether it be Spurs or Raptors or the Clippers, I think that's sort of a worry, because where, you know, if he was sort of in this, if he was sort of interacting with medical staff and the league and stuff like every other player, you'd feel more confident in what was saying was always the case. But certainly some of the shenanigans with the Spurs and even here at the Clippers, I guess it makes you sort of mistrust. You can't really, you got to take everything you hear about Kawhi with a bit of a pinch of salt. So sort of less trusting in him, but I guess that's reflected in the ADP, because if we were confident that Kawhi was going to have, you know, a 65, 70 game season, he'd be a first round player for sure. So just the fact that he's going 38th overall on average in drafts, it sort of shows that the consensus is that people don't trust that he's going to have a full healthy season. So on that basis, I actually do value him a bit higher than 38th. I think we saw in the second half of last season in particular, when he sort of worked through his, his nagging injuries, that he did play a lot of games during a significant portion of the season there. And he was also, I believe, sort of a top offensive weapon. He had a lot of usage and carried a lot of offensive load for the Clippers, while still being a top 30% defender in the NBA. So he's still a really, really good player. And you would think that after multiple seasons of sort of not being able to put it all together, that he would be more motivated to try and put a whole season together. I guess there's he's sort of already cemented his legacy. But like, why still be in the league if you don't think that you've got a chance at having another run at a title? So sort of the clock's ticking on that for him, and also for Paul George. So for that reason, I think that they both will be motivated to do well this season. I believe they're both extension eligible as well. So that's another motivating factor. I think, if they were to shit the bed again this season, their future on the Clippers might be called into question. I'm pretty sure Ballmer wants to win, and that's why he brought those guys in, and they just haven't been able to put it together. So I think there's a few factors sort of stacking up in the positive, on the positive side of the scale, to suggest that those guys will be motivated to have a good season. I think there's a recognition that in the West in particular, you really need to have a decent regular season to place yourself well in the playoff race. So I would take Kawhi definitely in that area, if not a little bit earlier, because if he hits, he'll be a game changer for you. If you get a first round guy in the early fourth round, let's say you were you're picking, I guess in order to hit that 36, you'd have to be picking on the turn there. So yeah, if you were to pick on the turn and maybe pair a Dame with an AD, and then come in at 36 and pick 36 and 37 and pick up Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, or even Kawhi Leonard and another player, if that sort of came together, your team would be very difficult to deal with. So do I trust them? Not completely. Would I draft them in and around the place where they're going? I think yes. And for me, it's probably Kawhi more than Paul George that I would go for, only because I believe the sort of upside there is higher than it is with Paul George.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I was looking at Yahoo ADPs and Kawhi is, I believe, 27, Paul George 30. So that's too high for me. 38 and 36 is a little bit better. I think I would, not the second round, definitely in the fourth round, maybe late third round. I think it would depend on how the first two rounds go for me. Your example of Dame, AD, and then potentially Paul George, Kawhi, or Kawhi, somebody else. I was going to say, I don't think that we've been talking about it. Injuries aren't something you can predict. You can look at quote unquote injury prone guys, but in reality, it's not really much you can predict. Maybe a little bit more so with guys like Kawhi and Paul George who have their repetitive knee injuries. But I don't think I would take a guy that's injury prone like Anthony Davis or has that label and then also take Kawhi. I think I'd have to limit myself to only getting one of those guys, because if it happens again for like the fourth, fifth season in a row, and those guys are only able to play 50 games, that kind of really hurts your season. So I think if I were to get my first two picks were guys that are going to play a lot of games, well, obviously you can't predict injuries, but have had a track record of playing, I'd say 60 plus games. Maybe at least one of them has played 70 plus games the last few years. Then probably I'm comfortable taking a Kawhi or Paul George there. But I don't know. It's probably basically malpractice to take, two guys or one guy in the first two rounds that has played barely at all, or not barely at all, but significantly less than other guys going in that range. And then to go back the next couple rounds and get like Kawhi and Paul George. Because then if it happens again, you're just asking for it at that point.
Yeah, it depends how risk averse you are, and I guess how much it's costing you to go in the league, and as in like if it was like more of a DFS setting, where you're sort of putting in multiple lineups, and in this case that would mean like you're going in multiple leagues, and you're just having a punt on this strategy because if it all comes together, then you're going to win that league for sure. Then I think that's fine to do. It could all work out, but if you're sort of going in 2 or 3 leagues and or maybe even one league, maybe it's not the best strategy, because to your point, like the odds that one or more of those guys, go down in time and your season's just over, then you really got to take that into account.
Yeah. So we'll move on to how does Russ fit in? So I referenced their playoff series against it was against the Suns, excuse me. I was about to say against the Clippers, but they are the Clippers. Last year, and I'm pulling up his numbers from those right now. It's that first game. I'm like talking so I can get to it. Okay, first game he shot 3 of 19, but had 9 points, 11 rebounds, 8 assists, 2 steals, 3 blocks. And then throughout the series, averaged 23.6 points, 7.6 rebounds, 7.4 assists, 1.2 steals, 1.4 blocks, 2 threes. Horrible efficiency. But he really only got to that point because Paul George was out and Kawhi only played in the one game, and he kind of had to. So now we're seeing Russell Westbrook is capable of still putting up big numbers with horrible efficiency in a playoff setting, which is, I guess it's refreshing to see, because after a really bad like year and a half stretch with the Lakers where everyone was saying Russell Westbrook is just not good at basketball anymore, or a lot of people were saying that, I guess not everybody. It's good to see him kind of have more of a home and play better basketball at the Clippers. I think even after the trade, it just felt like Russell Westbrook was in a better place and was playing better basketball. But if there's any sort of expectation from anybody that, he just did this in the playoffs, well, why can't he do it in the regular season? I think they're going to be pretty disappointed. He's not going to do that. But what can we kind of expect from him in a scenario where Paul George and Kawhi come into the season healthy? Obviously, when they miss time, his offensive role increases. But when we look at the season as a whole, assuming they're at least playing 50 games at minimum, and then hopefully more than that, how does Russ fit into that scenario?
I still think not good, to be honest with you. He'll probably have a reasonable role. I expect that he's going to be starting point guard for them. There's actually not a lot behind him, or I guess not a lot of competent or overly competent guards behind him. So we got maybe Bones Highland as being Russ's reserve. Who else have we got on there that could potentially slide into a bit of a ball handling role? I guess Terrence Mann can handle the ball a little bit, Norman Powell, but both not really traditional point guards per se. So I just don't think there's much of a threat to him from the players that are currently on the roster. So he'll definitely start, but is he going to contribute to winning basketball? Is he going to come into the season and accept a lesser role than he's had in the past? Or do we see sort of, you referenced his playoff performance. He had a few high notes there. Has that sort of re-instilled confidence, self-confidence, where he's going to want to sort of be a bit more of the man again? What happens if, Kawhi or PG are not starting the season? Is he going to see himself as the alpha dog? I think all of those things would be problematic for him, because I think if he does anything other than sort of accept a lesser role than he's had in the past. I know that you sort of mentioned that the time in LA sort of humbled him a little bit, and by LA, I mean the LA Lakers. And then when he came to the Clippers, he was a bit more subdued and actually a more positive contributor. Can he continue with that? I sort of tend to think that, it'd be a mix of the two. Russ will intend and mostly deliver that sort of more sort of passive role that they want for him, but he won't be able to help himself in terms of possibly wanting to take the last shot in the clock, or making some horrible decisions when he's got the ball in his hand in clutch time and so on. So I actually think that there's less of a possibility that he gets the John Wall treatment than John Wall got. But I wouldn't say that's out of the question for us if he doesn't sort of stay in his lane on the Clippers. Expect that he will. But having said all of that, right, last year, what did he finish about? 120th? Terrible field goal percentages, even though that did come in quite a bit when he moved over to the Clippers. Horrible at the free throw line, so he really sort of kills you there. I don't typically incorporate turnovers into my thought process, but when you've got such dramatically poor turnover rate, and I'd be potentially taking you in the 10th or 11th or 12th round, I really don't want to get 3.5 turnovers a game off someone at that point in the draft, unless I'm really sort of completely punting that category. So all in all, I'd say, if I'm punting percentages, particularly if I'm punting, I guess like a free throw percentage, and I've got a lot of big men that can sort of I'm punting, free throw percentage. I've got a lot of big men that can bring up my field goal percentage. I could take Russ to get those assists late. He does contribute a few rebounds. He might hit the odd 3, 16 points a game. Isn't the worst thing to pick up sort of that late in the draft. So all in all, I think his fit on the Clippers is not the best, but they've who he's got, and they're going to go with him into the season. He's going to start, so it's going to have to fit. Does Russ sort of stay in his lane? Maybe. Probably not all the time. Would I take him in drafts? Only in very, very specific builds would I consider it. And even then, I think I would steer clear if I had another option.
Yeah. He played 12 games with Paul George and Kawhi last year, and he averaged 13.3 points, 5.4 rebounds, 7.3 assists, 1.3 steals, shot 46% from the field. Still turned it over 3.7 times per game, despite playing with those guys. So I like his fit and how he looked with the Clippers a lot better than with the Lakers. But like you said, even at his ADP, I don't know that I'm necessarily drafting him in most cases. He's great if you just really need some assists in the later rounds. But like you said, the turnovers are still going to be there and can really hurt you. The poor free throw shooting. He wasn't shooting a ton of free throws. I mean, he only took 2.9 per game at 68.6% with those guys. So not super, super, I don't know. He's still aggressive, but he's not getting to the free throw line the way he might have in the past. Not really killing you there. And the field goal percentage isn't as bad. Yeah, I'm just going to kind of roll with what you said about that. I like him, but I don't think I like him enough to necessarily take him in most scenarios.
Yeah, if your team really needs assists and you don't care about, or you can take his field goal and free throw percentage and his turnover rate, fine. But I just don't. Like me personally, I don't find myself in that situation too much.
Yeah. All right. So is there any center value here? They have Ivica Zubac. They have Mason Plumlee, which they kind of have somewhat of a minute split last year when they played together. Didn't really lead to great value for either guy, but somebody is, I mean, I would imagine Zubac still starts. Are either of these guys, aside from maybe as a later round pick, is there any real value there?
I think no, myself. I think it's basically more of the same. So I think you're going to get exactly what you got out of those two guys last season. So Zubac somewhere in that 110 to 120 range. You need some boards. You need a boost in blocks. His free throw percentage isn't the best, but it's not. It's not the worst. His volume at the free throw line's not massive, so it's not going to hurt you too much. It's not going to really help you in points. So, yeah, I might take Zubac if I really needed some boards and blocks late. And then as far as Mason Plumlee goes, I think it's pretty much the same story. He's probably finished the season a bit lower than Zubac did, even though he had that good, he had a lot of opportunity, let's say, on the Hornets to start the season because he only sort of came over to the Clippers midway through, I believe. Mm-hmm. But yeah, again, he's going to give you a bit of boards, not very many points, but a few, and a bit of field goal percentage late. He's actually significantly worse at blocks than Zubac is. And he's actually significantly worse at free throw percentage than Zubac is and tends to take a few more of them too. So if anything, it would be Zubac, but I'm not even that thrilled about him. There's too many better center options in the rounds that precede where you would have to take a Zubac or a Plumlee. So, you should be looking to get a Kongwu or Mark Williams or Mitchell Robinson, even one of those guys, in a round or two before. If you find yourself needing to draft a Zubac or a Mason Plumlee, you've probably messed up somewhere else in your draft, and I'd probably be more inclined just to see what's out on the wire, like first couple of weeks of the season.
Yeah, I was really high on Zubac heading into last season because he was literally the only center on the roster. I think they had Moses Brown on a training camp deal and then never really officially signed him until after the season started. He was the only center option. They still only gave him like 30 minutes per game. And then that just kind of dropped after they finally brought in another center. So I'm not super high on either of them this year. I just think that they're not interested in relying on a center. They're just interested in relying on their guards. But the last question is, what does the future look like? Everybody on this team is pretty much very old. I know you touched on it earlier, saying basically if they're not really competing this year or able to play a lot of games this year, we could see them definitely move on from this, strategy of trying to win around this team. They might try and rebuild, but really that only leaves on this team probably Bones Highland and Brandon Boston that you're necessarily keeping around, maybe Jason Preston. A lot of those other guys are, maybe guys you keep around as like veterans to help with the rebuild or retool. But a lot of those guys you're probably moving on from, trading for value, or they're going to want to explore their options. So this is a very general question, not necessarily something that like we have really great answers to, or that probably is going to impact much this season. I guess this may be a little bit more for Dynasty. What does kind of the future of the Clippers look like in your eyes?
Well, in a nutshell, I think it's like this. They need to perform better in the playoffs this season than they have the last few. And the reason for that is, we all saw how aggressive Steve Ballmer was when he bought the franchise. He sort of throwing his money around like it's nothing. massive salary, massive tax bill, doesn't care. Basically, the guy wants to win. I think that's the purpose behind spending all that money. It's to win a championship. That's what Bulmer really wants. And that's why he brought in Kawhi. That's why he traded, Shea and all of those draft picks to the Thunder for PG. Ironically, if he hadn't have done that, they'd probably be in a much better position. But I mean, he's been pretty patient. He made some bold moves, and he's living with the consequences. But as they start to recuperate their draft picks, and they also sort of approach extensions, which I believe both of them will be eligible, Kawhi and PG, for extensions in the not too distant future. I mean, this year, I believe it's both of them this year. In a nutshell, you're sort of at a crossroads, right? I definitely think they'll let this season play out and see if they can actually get to the Holy Grail or closer to it this season. And if they do, they move into their new stadium next year. And I believe that they would be thrilled to be taking in a team that went deep into the playoffs, and they'd probably run it all back and probably double down on the strategy that they've employed right now. But you'd have to be thinking that if they have another poor outing, it would be just time to tear it down. They'd probably trade off all those vets for whatever they could get. And then, keep maybe, a Bones Highland, a Kenyon Martin, Brandon Boston, even a Jason Preston on the roster, maybe even a Norm Powell, and then start trying to build around them through the draft, or maybe even through subsequent sort of aggressive moves for other stars. But I can't see Bulmer, just accepting this status quo ongoing for another, multiple years.
Definitely agree. When he's put this much money in, they've invested all this draft capital in trying to make this team win now. They need better results than what they've gotten. I'd imagine they try and do more of a retool scenario than necessarily break it all down, because they don't have their own first-round pick until 2027. So unless they're able to make a deal, trade away both Kawhi and Paul George and get multiple first-round picks back, which I don't know if that's necessarily the case at their age with their injury history the past few seasons. If they're able to get, nowhere near what even Utah got for Rudy Gobert, but unless they're settling with, okay, we'll trade away these guys that if they play there, they'll probably make it a late round pick and just really go through a slow rebuild. I can't imagine Steve Ballmer wanting to do that. I think it ends up being more of a retool. They might end up having to tear it all down at some point, but I don't know when that is. And when they do, it's going to be a long rebuild, because they don't have draft capital. They don't really have young guys that have a ton of value. Bones Highland might be able to get you a little bit of something, Brandon Boston a little bit, but they've kind of pushed all their chips in. They need to start having results soon. That's just kind of, and a lot of it is injury luck at this point. If they've had Kawhi and Paul George healthy every season for the last 5 seasons and haven't gotten it done, I'd imagine they've already started over at this point. But because it's continuous injuries, it's like, okay, well, what if? So it might end up just being more of the same for the next couple seasons, trying to make this work. And then when they finally have their first round pick again, then saying, okay, I guess we'll actually try and start over.
Yeah, I agree. It's going to be one of the more interesting storylines in the NBA over the next few years. But one thing we do know is that money is no object. So we could see some pretty quirky decisions made over in Clipperland.
Yeah. But that's going to do it we finally got through after about 2.5 hours, the whole Pacific Division, which, bodes well for the rest of the divisions. We might get to it by the All-Star break, but that's going to do it for this episode. Follow Bdub on Twitter at Hidden Upside. Follow me at NoRuben22. Like, rate, review, share this episode with anyone who you think would enjoy it. But Bdub, like I said, that's going to do it. Everyone, thanks for listening. And Bdub, thanks for joining me for this.
Thanks, mate.
You just listened to another episode from the Fantasy Basketball International Podcast Network. Thanks for joining us. And for more information about joining our community, please check out our website at fbibasketball.com.